This is the seminal case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, as presented by Angie MacArthur and Brian Riator. Educating the youth of America is of the utmost high priority, as education will keep this nation strong and healthy. The framers of the United States Constitution also felt that education was of high priority. However, they left that portion out of the United States Constitution and charged that each individual state would have to deal with the education of their youth. Each individual state was charged with writing their own constitution, and part of that document had to do with education and how each state would deal with education of the children who were living within that state. Some states did a super job educating all students regardless of what color their skin was. However, many states chose not to do a good job with educating the children and were willing to separate them or segregate them into white schools and black schools. Segregation? Is it separate but equal? In the coming years, segregation would show its true colors. The students who were segregated were not being provided an equal access to a quality education, which in turn caused many families to bring lawsuits to the lower courts to change this practice. Some of those court cases were Briggs versus Elliott, Boyling versus Sharp, Davis versus Board of Education of Prince Edward County, Virginia, and Gebhardt versus Ethel. Although each case had differing issues, the main issue of each case was whether or not state-sponsored segregation in public schools was constitutional. The Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka was a culmination of all of these lawsuits and was heard by the United States Supreme Court twice before being decided. The first hearing of the case was in 1952, and it was argued by a young, up-and-coming black attorney by the name of Thurgood Marshall, who was head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Marshall's key argument was that separate school systems for blacks and whites were inherently unequal and thus violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. There had been many cases previous to the Brown case that were not found to be in violation of the 14th Amendment. The justices of the Supreme Court realized that they were deeply divided over the issues raised within the case. However, most of the justices wanted to abolish segregation because they knew segregation was wrong, but consensus could not be reached over those minor issues raised within the case. Unfortunately, due to the time it took for them to try and reach consensus, the term ended for the court, and it would have to be heard again. The second hearing before the United States Supreme Court would be in December of 1953. Marshall was once again the attorney for the plaintiffs. But just prior to presenting the case before the United States Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, Fred Vinson, would die, and he would be replaced by Governor Earl Warren from California. This unexpected change in the courts would prove to be a huge benefit to the case and its supporters, because Chief Justice Warren was able to get consensus by all of the justices of the Supreme Court on this case, which had not been done in previous court cases of this magnitude. And on May 14, 1954, Chief Justice Warren delivered the opinion of the court, and that opinion stated, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. So therefore, segregation and separate but equal was no longer legal." Change would prove to be difficult for some states, especially those in the South, where segregation was the norm. The United States Supreme Court, in rendering its decision, did not give directions to the states on how to desegregate. Each state's attorney general was supposed to put together a plan on how to desegregate the state's schools. But again, in the South, they would drag their feet, haul people back to court, have hearing after hearing on desegregation until finally the United States Supreme Court stepped in and gave them a plan on how to desegregate. And desegregation was to proceed with all deliberate speed, is what the court said. This plan that was handed down by the court would be called Brown 2. Now the key question is, did this case bring an end to segregation in public education?
Despite being over 60 years removed from the Brown decision, there are still many inequalities in public education, and segregation seems to be alive in the 21st century. The sad truth is that the students are the ones suffering the greatest impact. Darling Hammond presented data that in 2000, 72% of the nation's black students attended predominantly minority schools, up significantly from the low point of 63% in 1980. To this day, students who are living in poverty and minority students do not receive the same opportunities as middle and upper class students. Inner city schools struggle to provide resources for learning and are frequently staffed with uncertified or underqualified teachers. If families have the financial means, they can choose to send their children to a better school. However, families do not have the financial means to send students to better schools, so the students are left to attend the poorly resourced schools and receive an education that is not of the same high quality that other children in a suburban setting are receiving. This inequality in educational opportunity has an economic as well as academic impact. According to Darling Hammond, in The Flat World and Education, How America's Commitment to Equity Will Determine Our Future, the inequality impacts earning power between low-income families and middle-class families. She questions if standards built upon a foundation of continued inequality in education will simply certify student failure with greater certainty and reduce access to future education and employment. There's also a question of inclusion. Should the discussion be broader than black and white? Zirkle and Cantor question if the focus should now be on a broader level of inclusion, not just black and white, but a true multicultural community inclusive of all groups. And if so, how can schools facilitate an inter-ethnic community? Brown v. Board of Education continues to impact current court cases. The case was used as a precedent in a decision by the Supreme Court in Wygant v. Jackson in 1986, where the courts found that racial discrimination applied to not only students but to staff as well. It is truly amazing how far-reaching the Brown v. Board case has been in making sure discrimination does not continue in public schools. In 2002, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of California low-income students of color. The case presented evidence of grossly deficient resources from Luther Burbank Middle School. According to Darling Hammond, segregation has worsened and disparities have grown in the past 2 decades. According to In Public Schools, the final analysis is that Brown v. Board of Education gave people the option of integrating schools, but did not make it mandatory. Did Brown v. Board of Education succeed? It does not seem to have done so. The law failed to desegregate every public schools, and inequalities still exist today.